Hare Krishna Sutava Prabhu. Welcome to the Monks podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's wonderful to be with you once again. When I visit London, I look forward to your association. And the first time I heard about you was when I read your book on the Bhagavad Gita with acronyms. And since then, as we have interacted, I've seen that you have a very you have been able to present bhakti wisdom in a very creative and accessible way. And so maybe I thought today we'll talk about this, not just like making bhakti wisdom accessible and applicable in people's lives, what is required for that. So we could start with a little bit about your background. How did you come to the point of doing this particular service? How were you introduced? And
Sure. I grew up not too far away from Bhaktivedanta Mana, so I was exposed to the tradition from a young age. But my interest grew over time at university, and when I was 21, then I decided to take some time out after graduating, and I came to Chowpatty, India for 6 months and spent some time there.
This was which
and
year?
Then pardon me?
Which year was this roughly?
This was in 2002.
Okay.
Yeah, so I spent 6 months there at that time. And then when I came back, I decided to take a little bit more time out. And as years went by, I remained in the Brahmacharya ashram. So I've been here coming up to 20 years now at the Mana. And it's been an amazing journey and learning so much. And we'll hopefully be able to share some of those things today.
So were you one of the pioneers of the Pandav Seva? Because there is this whole program of sabbatical and devotees coming here. So were you one of the first batches in that?
Yeah, the Pandava Sena were formed when the Bhaktivedanta Mana was potentially being closed down. So that was in kind of around 1996, around that time. That's when I first came in contact with the devotees. And I became, I guess, a bit more of a serious practitioner later on, and was involved in Pandava Sena. But I wasn't a batch of the first pioneers, but I was around at that time. Yeah.
Okay. And you have been, so when you came there, was there already a vibrant program for training youth, whether they become brahmacharis or they become congregation, or that grew over the years?
Yeah, what happened is the Pandava Sena were vibrant, active in many areas. They were sharing Krishna consciousness at many universities, and they would have local programs. But at that time, no one from the Pandava Sena was really having ashram training. That tradition had not begun. And what we did in 2002 is we began a program called the sabbatical, where they could take 6 months out after their university and experience ashram life, and then go back either into the world or remain in the ashram. And so we began that program. And over the last 20 years, I guess we've had in the region of something between 150 to 200 devotees who have taken 6 months out like that. And it's become, a bit more of a tradition now for everyone, when they get the opportunity to have some time in absorbed Krishna consciousness as an experience, with the potential for it to become more long-term.
Oh, okay. So, so in one sense, if I consider the London temple and the whole project in London, that's probably one of the most successful models of outreach that we have in the Western world. And of course, I would say as our movement has evolved, while the manor is a place where you have the ashram and you have devotees residing, but around that you also have quite a vibrant community. So when you came in at that time, and since the years onward that have passed, we can see clearly, I think in India it's evident, in the West also it's evident, that we are at a moment, at a time when devotees may come into the temple and stay in the temple for some time. I think that's happening probably the in there in Manor, maybe a little bit in Krishna House in America, but otherwise most devotees are likely to be congregation devotees. So
yeah, for sure, that's what we've experienced over the years. I think when we were young brahmacharis, when we had just joined, we had a dream that all the young devotees would join the temple and would be bursting at the seams. And over years, we've realized that perhaps that was a little immature, and that having an experience of ashram life for some period is wonderful, is empowering, is very edifying for devotees. But yeah, the vast majority will live in the congregation, will have a family and a job, and hopefully still practice Krishna consciousness. So yeah, we've seen that. And I think one kind of, if I look at my 20 years here at the manor, then I can almost make a very clear divide of my first 10 years and my second 10 years. And my first 10 years were very much about developing the brahmachari ashram, about traveling and preaching, distributing books around the country, very much about speaking at programs. So it was very much a kind of more of an outreach program. We were planting a lot of seeds, and that was my experience of sharing Krishna consciousness. We had a goal to try and do one day of book distribution in every single town in the UK. So we would almost hop from town to town and try to do at least one full day of book distribution and cover every single town in the UK. It was kind of an aspiration.
That's quite, you're able to do that?
There's about 560 kind of towns of a certain size within the UK. So we got that list and managed to do about 380. So
that's still huge. Huh? I can think of the youthful energy that must have driven that kind of ambition.
Yeah, it was kind of, it was an adventure going out there, almost like a spiritual kind of army squad, jumping out of the van, doing a day of book distribution, packing it all up, and then just traveling to the next place. And so it was a lot of planting seeds. And I think that was very nice. That was very wonderful. It was a great experience for us. And what happened is that towards the end of those first 10 years, we began to realize that it's nice to plant many seeds, and it's nice to give people an initial exposure to Krishna consciousness. But then we also really have to care and cultivate and walk with them along the journey of Krishna consciousness. So I think my second 10 years very much kind of, were a contrast, In these last 10 years, I've been doing a lot more with the community, a lot more with cultivating, counseling, trying to care for devotees. I've had a lot more experience in terms of brahmacharis making a transition from being in the ashram to going into the community and helping them with that transition. A lot more to do with education. We begun something called School of Bhakti, where we kind of do systematic courses, educating. So it was very nice, those two aspects of, I guess, broad aspects of sharing Krishna consciousness, almost the quantitative, going out there and giving as many people as much contact as possible, and then the more qualitative of actually then trying to really help those individuals in a very personal way to practice spiritual life.
That's beautiful. When you're speaking this, I was also thinking about my life. My first, it is not exactly similar, but that idea of dividing into, I've been a brahmachari for maybe 23, 24 years now. So the first 10 years, I was also very much centered on youth outreach. travel to various youth outreach programs and do outreach and help in the essentially the building of the brahmacharya ashram with youth outreach. But then after that, it's almost like entirely I have started traveling abroad, and traveling abroad means mostly it's congregation outreach. And it's almost like when your service changes, even our definition of what Krishna consciousness is changes. We understand Krishna consciousness many aspects, but still, so we, depending on the service that we are doing, we perceive Krishna consciousness in particular ways with particular priorities, particular emphasis. So I think that's why for you, once you started training, doing courses, and whenever I have been to UK, also I've seen that you have a culture of systematic courses and education, which we don't have many parallels in the world. I think apart from MIHE, UIHE, you must be one of the pioneers for doing systematic courses, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, systematic education in the UK has been going on for many years. We're blessed with many disciples of Srila Prabhupada who are incredible educators. And therefore, there were different programs over the years at the Manor. There was something called Manor Training and Education. Then there was the College of Vedic Studies. Then there is now the School of Bhakti. So in the UK, it's definitely, and the Manor in particular, it's been something which has been developed over many years and decades, and such a valuable program. But just coming back to one of your points about when our service changes and how our vision of Krishna consciousness changes, I remember one of the most defining points in changing my perspective or evolving my perspective of Krishna consciousness was when I began to work with one group of devotees, and I worked with them for 2 years. Now, what had happened is for many years, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday were almost like the preaching days at the Manor. So there would be a circuit of programs, and what we do is every week we just do the circuit. So it would mean, you go to a different Sangha every week, and you give a class, try to give some inspiration, and then you do the next one and the next one. And by the time you've done the circuit, you come back to the first one after 3 or 4 months and then begin again. And like this, it was just doing many, many programs and many, many classes. And that was very satisfying in many ways, because devotees appreciated the inspiration. And we felt as though we were meeting many different people and sharing. But then what happened is some devotees suggested, why don't you work with one group of people for 2 years and meet them every single week? And for me, that was kind of a revolutionary concept, because I thought just one group of people, 20 people, just every week, but I can contact so many people. They said, no, it may be an edifying experience for you. And so I began with 20 individuals, meeting them every week. And then naturally it becomes more than giving a class. You kind of understand what's going on in their life. Not only do you understand what's going on in their life, they begin to share their obstacles, their issues, their difficulties with you. And what happened over those 2 years is, I think, more than ever before, it began to occur to me how much someone has to go through in order to become a devotee of Krishna. And I think previously in my life, I had never really appreciated that. Here I was, a brahmachari living in the ashram. It's pretty straightforward in one sense. You have a program. And I would go out and I would tell people to do the same thing. And in my mind, it was very simple. Just follow the process. But only when I actually began getting involved with devotees, then I realized how much more there is to develop awakening Krishna consciousness in others, how much more it is than just giving a class. There's so much more to it.
That's fascinating. So in one sense, what we are talking about is not just giving the information or the intellectual inputs. That's what we do by giving classes to help people become Krishna conscious. But then there is a whole set of other supports that are required. So I also realized that actually when you get off the Vyasasana and talk with people at a one-to-one level, they learn so much more about what they are thinking, what they are going through. So, so in one sense, if we consider the traditional situation in India, people had a whole supportive community that helped them to be spiritual. So, what are the dimensions that you feel are required, say, to apart from giving classes, and how have you worked on them?
Yeah, before I come to that, Chaitanya, let me just share one other thing with you. I think when we only give classes, not only is it incomplete, but you could actually be doing an injustice to devotees. This was one of my reflections, and I'll share what I mean. In a class, I think what we're trying to do, a platform speaker is basically trying to create a gap in someone's consciousness, a gap in terms of establishing an ideal for them to aspire towards that they're not currently at. So when someone comes and speaks on the platform, essentially what they're doing is they are creating a gap, because they're saying, this is the ideal of spiritual life, and this is the reality of where we're at the moment, and this distance needs to be made up. And creating that gap is very good, because it gives people an opportunity to realize where they have to move towards. So say,
That's interesting.
but then,
yeah, go ahead.
But it's very dangerous as well. Like, say, for example, we give a class and we talk about detachment, for example, which is an important part of spiritual life, detachment, renunciation is an aspect. Even for householders, there's a sense that these principles are universal. Now, you can create a lot of inspiration through philosophy of detachment. But if you don't simultaneously give the personal guidance on detachment in someone's life, they can hear a class, generate an inspiration, and then go out of that class and create a mess in their life. Or, for example, in a class, you can create great inspiration about this is where we should be in Krishna consciousness, and you create a great aspiration in someone, and it's inspiring. But then when they go out into the world, they're not able to rise to that aspiration that you've set for them. And therefore, it can become very depressing or frustrating. So a platform speaker, their job is to create a gap. But what happens is, if we don't simultaneously have things which help people to then bridge the gap, then we're kind of doing half of the job, and we can actually create more mental anguish and frustration within devotees. Like I often say, there's a gap between the real and the ideal, and this gap is frustrating. So there's three ways in which you can deal with this gap. One way is just leave spiritual life altogether, because the gap's too uncomfortable. I feel too guilty. I feel like I'll never get there. I become hopeless and say, just forget about this gap, blank it out. Obviously, that's not good. The other way to deal with this gap is you bring the ideal down. You say, like, okay, no, they talked about that in class, but it's not really practical. No one really does that. Let's just be realistic. Let's bring the ideal down. So now there's no gap. You feel better, but you won't achieve spiritual perfection because you've compromised, you've diluted the purity. So the only way is to raise the real to the ideal. But to raise that real, it requires personal coaching. So I just wanted to share this with you, that platform speakers are meant to create a gap between the aspiration and the real. but then we need to help them fill that gap and rise.
That's an amazing thought. I I put it this way, that I write on the Gita regularly. So one of the things which I find is that at the end of a class, is the audience feeling inspired to rise, or is the audience feeling intimidated by how far they have to rise? So, if you are doing the second, then actually our class may philosophically perfectly right. It may be with abundant scriptural information. We can say every single point in the script that I quoted, I can justify based on scripture. But what is the effect? The effect is not really anukul to bhakti. So when you say that third part, it requires coaching. So by coaching, because the word coaching has a technical meaning also, do you mean that it's more like a one-to-one relationship where people share what problems they are facing and how those problems can be dealt with?
Yeah, perhaps I can share this quote with you, and I'll just put it up on the screen, and perhaps you can share it with everyone. This is a quote which really helped me to understand a lot more about this. It's a beautiful quote from Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, where he says, "One who gives personal instruction to each and every one does more for others than the platform speakers do. Generally, whatever platform speakers say cannot solve the problems of everyone in the audience, nor can it always benefit every individual. A person's defects are better rectified in a private tutorial class or private coaching than in hearing lectures in a school or college. Therefore, those who instruct particular persons separately can award them something more permanent." So it's a very powerful quote. I mean, it just so much corroborated with what I was seeing before my eyes. And I think when we talk about personal coaching, I think there are different aspects. One is obviously one-to-one, having a friend, a mentor, a counselor, a coach, a shiksha guru, whatever we may call it, and that dynamic. I think there is also something to be said for 3 or 4 or 5 devotees coming together in a smaller group, and in that dynamic, kind of unpacking the teachings in a different way. And then I think also what I would say is when we give classes, I think we can do an element of coaching work in the class as well, by giving, along with the philosophy, by giving in that class also aspects of practicality, aspects of application, aspects of nuance, understanding of how this philosophy plays out in the real world. And so, I would see on those 3 levels when we talk about coaching. Add a bit of coaching into the class, create groups which are almost like in a university, you have like a tutorial where there's a smaller group, and then the one-to-one exchange, heartfelt exchange. And I think when we create those, and then I would say around that also just a community, a loving community where there are friendships, where, informal exchange goes on of the things that we're learning.
That's so true. What I was thinking about is that two broad thoughts I had when thinking about this 3-level approach, that actually maybe we also need to, we could say, expand our definition of what success in Krishna consciousness is. Like you said, your first few years, the definition of Krishna conscious success was often how many books we distributed, how many temples we built, how many devotees were made or initiated or introduced. Now, those are all important definitions of success, but actually to internalize Krishna consciousness in a sustainable way, we need a more holistic definition of success also. because the kind of work that you're talking about, that requires time, that requires effort, and it's not that you can have like a trophy kind of success. I did this much and this much. It requires a certain level of rising from rajoguna to sattva even in our even in our pursuits in Krishna consciousness, because we pursue certain things as our desirable goals in Krishna consciousness. So have you started implementing this, and how has the response been for you as you try to do this?
I think one very important thing is whatever we acknowledge and highlight within our communities, that is ultimately then what devotees pursue. So I think a lot of it begins with what is glorified within our movement. If we glorify the numbers of books going out, then naturally all the devotees will aim towards that. And that's what they will aspire for, because they will see that that is what the leaders are talking about. That's what everyone's talking about. And if I do that, then I'll also be part of that acknowledgement. So I think we need to appreciate numbers. We need to appreciate that we are a movement in which we are trying to contact and plant as many seeds as we can. But I think all we need to do is bring in also a greater appreciation and acknowledgement of the devotees and the services that are going on to actually do the qualitative aspect of Krishna consciousness. And perhaps that tends to go in the background because it is for different sociological reasons that may not be promoted as much. So I think one important thing is what we appreciate, acknowledge, and highlight publicly. That is subconsciously what the devotees will then pursue. So I think in order to create this change, we need to acknowledge the devotees who are serving in many different capacities.
True. So can we maybe go into a little more specifics? Examples, say, what would be a platform speaking? What would be a message in platform speaking that could create an uncomfortable gap? And how would, say, personal coaching help bridge that gap? Any examples you would like to give for this?
I mean, I think probably one of the most common ones is our talk of purity. Purity is such a word in Krishna consciousness, where we're looking for pure devotional service, and so in our classes we talk a lot about purity, and we talk a lot about the standard, the highest standard. For example, in one's personal conduct, in one's personal sadhana, in one's personal character, of how one should be. And people are inspired by that. We're inspired when we hear about becoming non-envious. We're inspired when we hear about chanting, all your rounds in complete absorption. We're inspired when we, hear about all these aspects of purity. We know purity is the essence, and that's what we're trying to go towards. But then the reality is, when someone walks out of the class, we are faced with our own weaknesses. We're faced with our own inabilities to live up to that purity. And then what we need at that stage is someone to come to us and say, yes, that purity is there, but it's about progress, not perfection. And you should be happy where you are, and also trying to get to the next step, the next stage, and then someone to then give incremental steps towards that purity, and actually help devotees by giving them tangible things they can do to get towards that purity. Otherwise, as you said, that purity will become intimidating more than actually inspiring and creating upward mobility in one's spiritual life. So that can be a very, very common one that we kind of come across.
True. So overall, this, when I travel across the world, and there are there are many devotees who feel that, did we do we over promise and under deliver? That means that, do we actually say that, no, you will become blissful in Krishna consciousness, chant Hare Krishna and be happy? And the reality is there are a lot of challenges. My understanding is not that the challenges themselves are the problem. It is quite often the unexpectedness or the unpreparedness for the challenges that is the problem. So if, in one sense, what you said is that the platform speaking creates a gap, but it also creates an unrealistic expectation that the gap can be easily treaded, relatively speaking. It doesn't sufficiently address the reality and the gravity of the challenges that are going to come when we try to address that gap. And when we actually get into doing it, that's when the problems start coming. What are your thoughts about that?
Like leadership is, like when I think about leadership, I think about three things. Leadership means you have to give inspiration, but then after that, you have to give education. And then after that, you have to give facilitation. And you have to actually, or, another way to look at it is teaching is the 4 E's, I say. The first thing is to engage. You have to be engaging. You have to bring people in. You have to connect. The second thing is then you educate. You give the information. Then the third thing is you encourage. You actually generate an emotional buy-in to the education that you've given them. And then the fourth thing is you empower. You actually then give them the tools and the practices to live it. And I think when we're talking about under-delivering, we're failing on, not failing, we could be doing better on the empowerment and the facilitation. For example, I'll give you an example, like 5 years ago, we did a whole push for as many congregation devotees to go out on book distribution as possible. And somehow or other, in the manner, we managed to mobilize over 500 devotees in actual face-to-face book distribution, either in door-to-door or on the street. And you wouldn't believe the number of devotees who came to me after and said, Prabhu, for years, we've been told, distribute books, distribute books, distribute books. And for years, we were given the same message year after year when the marathon came. And what we wanted to tell the speakers is that you don't need to convince us. We're inspired. We're on board. Please don't just give us the instruction again. We've bought into your idea. But what they said is that people just kept giving us the inspiration, but they never gave us the education and the facilitation to actually live the inspiration. And it was just adding that extra element to just say, this is actually how you do it. And you know what? We are going to walk with you through that experience and help you to do it. And the encouragement and empowerment that comes from that means it just activates one's journey. And so that when sometimes people may say we're under delivering, maybe that's the aspect we're under delivering in. More focused. I'll give you another example. Like you've been to many retreats.
Just to contextualize this, sometimes I feel that, say, there is Sambandha, Abhidheya and Prayojan. So we emphasize the Sambandha Gyan quite strongly. And then we also emphasize how glorious our Prayojan is, Parkiya Bhav and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's love for Krishna. But often the Abhidheya needs to be made clearer. So it's something similar. In this case, you could say the Prayojan is distribute books. We want to distribute a lot of books. And Sambandha is, we want to serve Srila Prabhupada, we want to serve his movement. But as you said, the training, how to providing some kind of support to be able to do that. So that is also a form of Abhidheya.
Yeah.
Yes, Prabhu. Please, you can.
Just on that Abhidheya, Sambandha Abhidheya Prayojana, another interesting thought is that In Sambandha and Prayojana, we may not necessarily come face to face with our human weakness. In Prayojana, you're a pure devotee, and everything is very, it's a beautiful picture. And in Sambandha, it all fits theoretically. But in Abhidheya, we're faced with our own human weakness. We're faced with our own human inabilities. And we're faced with our own, impurity. And so, like, one thing I always think about is that there cannot be purity unless there's honesty. One devotee explained it like this. I've never read it like this, but it made sense to me. We say there's 4 defects of the conditioned soul. So he kind of put it in an order, and he said, we have imperfect senses. Therefore, the potential to come under illusion is there. And therefore, we're likely to make mistakes. And therefore, we cheat to cover it up. So he put it in an order. I never read that anywhere, but it kind of made sense. And then what he said is that the imperfect senses coming under illusion and making mistakes, to some extent, you can't do anything about that. But the one thing you can do something about is the cheating propensity. And so Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur says, weakness is acceptable, but cheating is outlawed. And therefore, one of the most important things is that when we do make mistakes, when we do fall short, when we do fall prey to our imperfection, are we going to have the honesty and truthfulness to interact with the devotee and bring it out and rectify it in a progressive way? And in order for that to happen, there needs to be personal exchange. There needs to be relationship. There needs to be genuine devotee contact, because we're not going to be able to do that. Most are not going to be able to do that just by hearing a class and doing it within their own selves. And that's why personal coaching is. But I'll say one other thing, Guru, that here's some food for thought. And I don't know, maybe you can reflect on whether you also have this experience. But here in the UK, we have our former temple president, Akandadi Prabhu, and he doesn't anymore, but for many years he was running a retreat center in Wales. And so he would play host to many, many groups who would do retreats there, self-development groups, spiritual groups. And he would also play host to the devotees who would come there for a retreat. And one time I asked him, what is the difference between our retreats and general, other spiritual groups or self-development groups, the difference between our retreats and their retreats? So he was giving me different differences between us, just so I could understand a bit about how we could learn from them. And one interesting thing is, he said, our retreats are full of different lectures about different subjects. So for example, we have 4 days of classes, morning, afternoon, and evening. And we talk about so many different subjects, so much philosophy. Sometimes we could go, span many, many different topics. And what he said is, if you look at these groups, what they'll do is they'll come together for 1 weekend or 4 days, and they'll talk about one thing, like gratitude, for example. And every single talk will be about gratitude. And then they'll have a workshop on gratitude. And then they'll kind of give people something to do in order to develop gratitude in their life. And in other words, they just build a whole meditation to take the kind of concept of gratitude and then really kind of embed it within the individual. And therefore, he was reflecting that sometimes he feels our retreats are just not focused enough. We talk a lot, but we don't do it in such a way that we translate it into such a way that it's livable and applicable. And I thought that was quite an interesting observation. But I don't know if you have any thoughts or reflections on that.
Hmm. 2 points. I'll talk about this first. Yeah, overall, there is often an assumption that the just the process will automatically produce the necessary virtues. If I'm doing my chanting properly, if I'm studying scriptures, whatever is the virtue that is desired, it will come. Yes, it can come, but that doesn't mean that that virtue doesn't need to be cultivated. So sometimes the focus is not so much on the cultivation of virtue as on the emphasis on the particular practices. And yes, we all could say study Shastra more, improve the quality of our chanting, but that is a lifelong process. And to experience substantial or tangible improvement in it at our level is not that easy. So I do agree that we rarely talk about specific virtues in sufficient detail. We may say that, okay, just see, this character has this virtue, and this character has this virtue, and this character has this virtue. So, like sometimes devotees, I have written a couple of books on the Ramayana, I'm working on something on the Mahabharata. Sometimes when we talk about practical lessons from the Ramayana, it is that you just see how Lakshman obeyed his older brother, or Sita was always faithful to Ram. We should be like that. Well, that's an inspiration, but that's not a guidance. So, in that sense, breaking things down to show how they can be applied, that is definitely, I would say, lacking. But it's a very striking observation. I hadn't articulated it that way. And going back to your earlier point about the four defects. In fact, I have a whole, like a visual presentation. I visualize this as four windows. Now, the imperfect senses is like one window. Then within that is the next window is the tendency to be illusioned. And each of these windows are placed one in front of another after another. Or you could say each of them are like doors or windows. So what happens is, actually, if I'm starting from here, what I get to see at the end is very narrow, because my accurate perception of reality will require knowledge to come through all the windows. So it is true, but the last point about cheating propensity being in our control, that's quite a insightful point. And I also felt that to some extent, if we don't have the facility for guhyam akhyati pruchyati, for loving exchanges, then devotees only have two options. One is, as you earlier said, that go away from Krishna consciousness, or cover up their inability to practice the standards of Krishna consciousness. So in that sense, rather than saying that it is the devotee who is being dishonest, we can also consider the fact that the environment is not really giving much encouragement or even opportunity for honesty. Because sometimes if somebody is candid, somebody is honest, they may be frowned upon, they may be looked down upon. I was at one conference on mental health and spirituality. So we often talk about how spirituality is a way to deal with loneliness because we connect with people. But there was the statistic that religious organizations that have high moral standards, within them, practitioners often feel more lonely than normal society. Because when they don't have, it's okay, if I'm failing in my moral standards, I can't speak with anyone about it. So I would say that the word, I hadn't thought of the word coaching. In fact, one of the reasons I started this monks podcast was to do guhyam akhyati pruchyati, and to also show how that can be done on various issues. But I very much recognize that without this, the heart is not nourished. So Prabhupada in the Nectar of Instruction, in that Guhyam Akhyati Uchati purport, he says, the Krishna consciousness movement is nourished by these sixfold exchanges. That's a beautiful phrase, nourished by these sixfold exchanges. So I fully agree with what you're recognizing as a need. No.
I thought it's quite ironic that, in this year and a half of COVID, when the devotees have been as far away, as ever, disconnected in one sense as ever, that many podcasts like this are coming up, which are in a sense actually bringing a more intimate type of exchange that we may never have had if the world was normal and we were having our normal gatherings. This podcast, Namaras Prabhu's podcast, and many like that, Wisdom of the Sages, and so all these have come up where actually devotees are, it may not be personal coaching in one sense, but it's more, I guess, bringing that philosophy onto our very real life experience and talking about that publicly, which actually, if you think about it, in our temples, we don't do maybe the closest we get to that is a Q&A session at the end of a class. So yeah, it's quite interesting.
Just yesterday, my uncle's birthday was there, so I had called him and talked with him, and he said that he also made a similar point that it's because of COVID, people are not running around so much, so they are having time. They're not talking physically, but they're at least talking digitally. And I would say that yes, sometimes what you talked about, confronting our human weaknesses. Sometimes some situations, we could say, push us or even force us to confront our weaknesses. And when I started this podcast, one of my friends told me that you had tried to do this 5 or 10 years ago. You would have said, why are you wasting your time? Do something constructive. So I agree that it's happened at the right time also. In one sense, we as a movement are also at a stage where we are reflecting about how to move ahead. There is a significant generational change. There's a significant demographic change. Earlier, we are mostly temple-based movement. Now we are a community-based movement. So we have Prabhupada's first generation disciples. The first generation is slowly leaving us. The second generation is now trying to do what it can. So how we are to move ahead, there is a lot of reflection happening, and I think the podcasts are a part of that whole system.
I was thinking, yeah, definitely. And I mean, so far in this session, we've talked a lot about the need for personal interaction, personal instruction, coaching. And perhaps we could look a little bit into that, like someone who's able to give other people good advice and coaching. Because once I was doing a seminar for one group of mentors that we have in the community. And what occurred to me was that giving advice is perhaps the most frequent service, the hardest service, the most rewarding service, and also potentially the most dangerous service that one can take up. It's such an amazing thing, to be someone who's in a position to give advice and serve others like that. But it requires also training and understanding on how to be a good coach. Because here we could be talking about the need in the Krishna consciousness movement for more coaches, more devotees who are actually helping other devotees on the ground. But then those devotees, how to give good advice to others and the mood in which they should do it, what they should do before they give advice, what they should do when they're actually giving the advice and how to formulate it, what they should do after they've given the advice, in order to serve others in the best way. So I don't know if you want to go down that route now,
Oh,
or
yes,
you have some.
definitely, I would say. So, no, just to contextualize what we discussed, what you said is we need to provide there is a need for advice. So, I like, in one sense, the word advice is much more non-threatening than instruction, isn't it? So, although advice is also, it involves a sense of that the person giving advice has some experience or expertise, but advice is it's a much more not just palatable from the audience perspective, but also realistic from the giver's perspective, because most of us in today's movement are not going to have so much access to, say, devotee guides who are so high up that we can immediately accept their instructions. So most of us may not have personal association with our spiritual masters, and even if we have access to them, how much time do they have for us? How much do they know us? So in one sense, that itself is the first thing that how would you differentiate between advice and instruction when we are giving?
I mean, one writer, he says, advice is what people ask for when they already know what they need to do, but they don't want to do it.
That's true. It's not necessarily a bad thing. In one sense, the super soul inside us is speaking something, and then we want some confirmation from the super soul. If you see in the
I
text,
like that definition because I feel it, like when we talk about instruction and we become an instructor, it's almost that first we put ourselves on a pedestal higher than others. And then for that person, there's the pressure of I have to be a conductor of the divine message, and sometimes it can become a little artificial, a little unrealistic, and a little utopian. I think advice is, there is a discussion, there is understanding, there is exchange, there's room for iteration, which I think is really, really important. Like when it's an instruction, it's this is what I'm telling you to do, now go and do it. Whereas when it's advice, I say some things, you say some things back. It's an iterative process, which kind of makes it more realistic. And I think when it's advice, it doesn't put undue pressure on the person as well.
the receiver or the
And
giver, or both.
on both, yeah, on both. Because there's a sense that when the person is receiving it, it's advice. I still have my own options. Still have my own space to kind of deal with that, how I want to apply it. And from the person's perspective of giving it, they're not claiming to be, the speaker of the holy word and the hallowed truth, but they're just sharing what they feel according to their experience and their knowledge of Shastra. So it becomes much more comfortable.
And in one sense, just to reinforce what you're saying about iterations, if you see, that's the model we have in Dhruva Maharaj and Narad Muni. Narad Muni tells him, don't take the insult so seriously. And Dhruva says, what you're saying is true, but I can't apply it. And Narad Muni gives him a more doable instruction for him. And also the point about advice, which you said, if you see the first conversation in the Bhagavatam between Vyasadeva and Narad Muni, there also Vyasadeva has himself inferred what I did wrong. I didn't glorify the Lord enough. And then Narad Muni comes and reinforces that. Narad Muni is quite forceful. Says, are you satisfied with glorifying the body and the mind instead of the soul? It's a rhetorical question. But that idea of confirming the intuition, that's very much there in scripture. In fact,
yeah, it's a really interesting point that sometimes I think if we don't give people space to reflect on their own situation, then we actually block them from coming to their own realization. Like, say, for example, Parikshit Maharaj puts the dead snake on Shamik Rishi. And what Shringi does is he just impetuously, almost impulsively just curses Parikshit. But what we hear about in that dialogue is that Parikshit went away and he actually began to lament that, oh no, I should not have done that. So he had come to a corrective conclusion himself. But what Shringi did is he came in and then he cursed. Of course, we know there's a divine plan, but it's an interesting point that when we come in too quickly with a reaction, then we actually don't give the other person time to actually come to their own realization.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
And therefore, I think one of the first, when we talk about giving advice, and it's almost a no-brainer, and we see it in Shastra again and again, but we have to say it, is we just need to first give people time to share what they want to say. We have to hear. The first chapter of the Gita is just Arjun speaking, Sarvabhaum Bhattacharya just speaking, not just jumping in there, because when we let people speak, three things happen. The first thing is we get to know their situation better. The second thing is that they get the confidence that you've understood their situation and therefore they're more ready to listen to you. And the third thing is that oftentimes, just by the person speaking themselves, they actually come to the conclusion of what they need to do. And therefore, just letting people speak and hearing them is so powerful. It's such an underrated thing.
So true, bro. In one sense, all the points I fully agree. The third point especially, actually thinking is a very difficult thing to do. Because in one sense, when we have to think, we have to simultaneously be like two persons. Okay, this voice is saying this voice is saying this. If I do this is the good about this is the good about that. And it's not so easy to think. But for many people, talking is the way of thinking. While talking, we develop our thoughts.
Disraeli, he said, most people hate to think. Some people think they think, and other people would rather die than think. It's a challenging thing. You're completely right. And talking it out is one way in which we can kind of open that thinking.
So in general, somebody who is actually going to be a coach, the first thing you are saying is they need to make themselves available. They need to have time. And again, that itself would require what you said earlier about a modification in our definition, or not a modification, and an expansion of our definition of success. If somebody is simply thinking of giving a lot of classes as the definition of success, then that's going to be difficult.
Yeah, no, for sure. I noticed with quite a few sannyasis who came to the manor, especially in recent years, that they implemented this. And what they would do is, as a sannyasi, you can be invited to unlimited numbers of programs. But what they would do is they would have a number of programs that they would do a week and not go above that number, and rather ring fence time in order to just meet devotees and speak to them one-on-one, and in order to maintain that balance, because the tendency is always to go towards quantity. I can say also as a speaker that when you make time to individually talk with devotees, then actually your ability to be a more relevant and powerful speaker increases. So even your impact as a speaker is nourished by the personal time you spend with individuals outside of classes, because that's where you really begin to grasp the needs, issues, and concerns of what people are going through. And then you're able to factor that into your presentation.
Beautiful. True. It's it's actually, there is speaking to people and there is speaking with people. So I would say a person who spends time with people, and they're actually, even when they're giving a public class, they're speaking with people. Because when they speak a point itself, then they will think, okay, how will my audience react to this point? What is the question that is going to come? And even when you see a talk that is addressing the questions that are going to come in our mind, then we find the talk engrossing. Otherwise, sometimes the talk becomes like just a series of platitudes, and then we switch off. So yes, I would say that even if we do this coaching, then we will shift more from speaking to people to speaking with people, even when they're giving the classes.
Yeah.
So one.
And I think that.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just. Sorry, you go.
No. So we were discussing about advice and instruction. I think in that topic only we went to in this direction. But you can complete your point, and we'll move ahead.
So I was just thinking, at the moment we're kind of, as someone advising someone else, we're just kind of brainstorming what we have to do before even we speak. And the first thing we said was that we should hear them, and give that time and give that attention. They say attention is the greatest gift you can give someone. And when you give someone attention, it's amazing what you can draw out of that person and what that person naturally wants to give out of themselves. And I think attention in listening, I mean, we do many workshops on empathetic listening and so on, but it is such a powerful thing if we're able to give people attention. And then the second thing I would say is questions are really important. Before you give any advice, to ask people questions. Because what happens when you ask questions is that you begin to not only pick up on the issue that someone is facing, but you also begin to get a sense of what their emotions are within that whole realm of that situation. And sometimes I think when we give advice, we're only addressing an issue without understanding the emotion of what someone is going through. And therefore, your advice may be great, but it won't hit the spot because there's a deeper emotional kind of thing going on there. So I think questions help to uncover emotions. Questions actually help you to get to the root cause of what someone's problem is. Oftentimes, people may voice a problem to you, but actually, all they're voicing is a very superficial level of the problem. And if you give advice to them just based on their superficial explanation of the problem, your advice will also be only superficial. And therefore, as a coach, what you really need to do is try to get to the deeper root. Okay, what is the actual problem here? Because what person voices may not be the actual problem. And when you ask good questions, and I think coaching is very much based around this, by asking good questions, a lot of the time you can help people find their own answer. And we've kind of talked about that as well. So
true.
We have to hear the unheard.
Yeah, I think the standard metaphor for this is the tip of the iceberg. It is every problem, when what is voiced initially is the tip of the iceberg. I also appreciate this here that it also requires people time to open up, because especially when somebody is sharing a deeply personal issue, it's there are 2-3 reasons. One is they themselves may not know what the deeper issue is. It's also because they are also trying to not only seeking a solution, but they're also seeking to understand what the problem is. So that is one reason why it's just the tip of the iceberg that comes out. Another is there is hesitation about how the other person will react. So the person, they speak something and they see how we react. And if we are not shocked, if you're not if you don't react in a very negative way, then they may open up a little bit more. And third is also that in general, it's by speaking. I do seminars on journaling. So one of the things I've stated over there is that words are not just tools for expressing our thoughts. Words are also tools for discovering our thoughts and for developing our thoughts. So both of them are there. And that's why patience is very much required to get to the heart of the issue.
Yeah.
So
and then I would say one more thing is very important before we give any advice. So hearing them, questioning them, and then probably the most important is reflecting. And oftentimes we have to do this on the spot because, someone's asking and then we have to respond. But there must be a good period or some qualitative reflection. And what does that reflection mean? Like to understand what they're saying and to really kind of clarify what the issue is, what the root cause of the problem is. Then we have to draw on our knowledge of Shastra, our knowledge of, the acharyas and what they've taught about different situations. So we have to draw then on spiritual knowledge. We then have to draw on our own experiences. I think also we need to, before we advise someone, we need to be very aware of our biases. Because sometimes we may have like a certain bias which sometimes we need to declare when we're speaking to them or giving advice to them, which helps them to then take it in the right way. So
what do you mean by our biases? For example?
Like say, for example, I grew up or I had a very strong experience in my early life that's created a very strong character trait within me. Say, for example, if I had trouble with authority figures in my youth, and therefore I have a chronic problem with trust. Therefore, if someone's asking me a question on authority or someone's asking me about a problem that they're having with an authority, and asking for advice in that situation, I may want to tell them that I do have very strong opinions on this because of experiences I've gone through in my life. Because otherwise what we do is we project our experiences onto others and kind of skew and are not neutral.
Actually, first of all, it takes a significant level of self-awareness to know about our biases. Then it requires a huge amount of candor to speak those, and especially to speak those to someone who is coming to us for advice. It's not that easy. So so giving advice it's also going to require a significant amount of maturity, sattva guna, isn't it? I'm not sure at what stage.
I like this.
Yeah, please go
ahead. I think this quote is powerful and it needs to be unpacked, but I think it has a lot of power in it if we think about it, which is that maybe nowadays we tell people what to think rather than how to think. And I kind of reflect on that a lot. And I think that's why I kind of came up with this point of biases, because we've had a lot of experiences in our life. And when we're giving advice to others, we can just project that onto them and tell them, this is how you should think. By declaring a bias or by declaring these things, we help them to understand how I'm coming to the conclusion of giving this advice to you. And we're helping them so that when they receive that advice, they can think about the advice, the biases, the space where it's coming from, and then think for themselves about what then needs to be done with that piece of advice.
True. Okay. So actually, in one sense, telling people how to think is education. Telling them how to think, what to think is, in some ways, it can be indoctrination. It's not a very healthy thing, because one of the aspects which I feel about advising is important is that advising shouldn't create a perpetual dependence in the advisor. The person should also learn to become independently thoughtful over a period of time. In fact, if we see the Bhagavad Gita, if Krishna had simply wanted to give an instruction to Arjuna, Krishna could have completed the whole Bhagavad Gita in 6 words. I am God, obey me, fight. The whole Gita would have been over. But Krishna doesn't do that. Krishna goes through a whole elaborate process of reasoning, by which he helps Arjuna say, okay, how do you reason? How do you analyze? How do you understand what are the ultimate values of life? And then Arjuna comes to a decision.
Reasoning, and yeah, definitely. And also, what does Krishna say again and again? Iti me mati. It's just my opinion. This is my opinion. And then Krishna obviously at the end says, Yata icha tata kuru, whatever your desire is, that you do. So it's almost that when he's advising, he's giving, he's guiding, but he's also creating space for someone to think. Yeah, so it's a dialogue, it's yeah.
That's beautiful. So now we talked about, first is what to do, what all that we should be able to hear, we should be able to admit our biases. And then one of the things which I find helpful, and maybe you can also reflect on this, that it's always better to give like a multi-level advice rather than like a 1-0 thing. Do this and don't do this. You can do this or do this or do this. What Krishna does in the 12th chapter of the Gita also, that 12 point, if you say 8 to 11, 12, you can practice at this level, at this level, at this level. So then people feel that, yeah, this makes sense. This I can do. Any thoughts
Yeah,
on that?
there's nothing worse for someone than feeling like a failure or feeling like they've let someone down. That can be very demoralizing, you know. Oftentimes Srila Prabhupada would even say, like, I changed the instruction just because I knew if I gave the ultimate instruction, the person wouldn't have been able to follow it, and it would have been injurious towards their spiritual journey. So I think it's a great point. We must give options. Krishna says, if you can't fix your mind on me, then engage in the regulative practices. If you can't do that, do this. If you can't do this, do this. Progress, not perfection. And what also happens when you give options is that when people, by your advice, are able to move forward even one step, then their capacity to embrace more advice and embrace more guidance increases. And then that means they can take more steps forward. So also giving advice is a relationship that needs to be built up cumulatively. And that means that the person giving the advice needs to have faith that this person is taking me seriously. And the person getting the advice should feel that the advice I'm getting from this person is helping me move forward. So when you give options, then what you eliminate is a situation where the advice is so high that the person can't follow it, and then the person doesn't move forward at all. Because if the person can't follow it, the speaker gets frustrated. And if they don't therefore move forward at all, they get frustrated, and then the whole relationship breaks down.
True. So this is when you say Prabhupada said that, I remember that with respect to divorce, like one devotee wanted to separate, and Prabhupada knew that they had already made the decision. So then Prabhupada didn't really put his foot down. But are there other occasions also when Prabhupada said, I don't give the highest? I'm sure there must be. If you see, in one sense, Prabhupada in the 1960s, had much more time, and Prabhupada was more like a coach for the devotees in the 1960s. If you read those chapters of the Lilamrut also, there's a very intimate mood at that time. So what we are talking about coaching is also modeled by Prabhupada in the early years of our movement.
Yeah. And I think connected to this point of giving options is to give advice which is achievable and at the same time challenging. And getting that, I think in the modern world of self-development, they call it your flow state, because they say you have a potential and then you have a challenge. And they say if the potential that you have is higher than the challenge, then you'll become bored. So you won't achieve your flow state. And if the challenge is higher than your potential, then you'll become too stressed and you'll break. So the flow state occurs when your potential is matched with a challenge. And then you almost achieve the maximum traction. And so it's very much an art. I think Srila Prabhupada used to say, bend without breaking, you know. So to give someone advice which is achievable, but at the same time challenging, and finding that mark. Because sometimes we can just be too light and just want to give people very easy advice, you know, and be the good person, you know, they're happy, you're happy, but there's not much growth. And the other time is we may just give something too high that they're not able to do. And then it, you know, as we said, it breaks down. So it's a real art to know, like Narad Muni tells Mugrari the hunter, like, don't, at least kill them fully. Don't half kill them. So it's almost like, you know, it's achievable, but it's like, you know, it's going to challenge them and bring them forward. So there's a kind of, you know.
Beautifully put, huh? That I had heard about flow, but this presentation of flow into the challenge and potential, one of the, you could say, one of the difficulties in the practice of bhakti is that we may have a certain set of preconceptions of where people should be when we are dealing with people. And then that creates a huge problem. For me, I spent, say, for the first 10 years of my life in India doing outreach only to youth. And then I started going to America. And then I realized the audience is entirely at a different level. And then, so they may, in the long run, have, everybody has the potential to love Krishna. But there are, I read recently one quote that, you know, there are no unrealistic goals, but there can be unrealistic time limits, unrealistic deadlines. So everybody can come to a level of purity, but not everybody can come to the level of purity in the same time. So I think that individualization of the presentation of bhakti, that is what is not possible if we are doing platform speaking. Now, I would like to just change the subject a little bit. See, within, not exactly change, but develop it in a different direction. See, we are within an institution, and there are certain standards that we expect practitioners to follow. So, to what extent can the coaching accommodate, say, lapse from the standards, deviation from the standards? And there is an aspect of standardization which is important, to have some kind of uniformity. Now, what is a particular movement about? But then people are every person is an individual, and nowadays almost every individual is coming from a quite a complicated background. So people are troubled. So what is when we are giving coaching, it's a matter of we have to invest time and energy and thought in coaching someone. So at one level, it's reasonable to expect some level of reciprocation. So how do we decide whom we are going to coach? Because we don't have the time to coach everyone. Not everyone is going to value the coaching also. So there has to be some basic denominator of, we can say, spiritual seriousness or spiritual interest. Any thoughts on that?
So how do we decide who we should coach or who we should be coached by, like that? How do we form
I
that
would say,
relationship?
yeah, I would say the second part. If we are going to offer time as a coaching to someone, as a coach to someone, how do we decide that? And also from the other perspective, we'll come to that. That, I would also not need a coach who is who expects too high things from me.
Generally, in Shastra, Rupa Goswami says in terms of friendship, he talks about like-mindedness, number one. Then he talks about trust and intimacy. And then he also talks about ashraya, ability to give spiritual shelter. So essentially, like, we gravitate towards taking shelter of and taking seriously the expectations and advice of individuals who we seem to, number one, be on a like-minded, similar wavelength. In other words, we have faith that they know us. The second thing is there's trust, there's intimacy. We have faith that they love us. And the third thing is that there's spiritual advancement there in that person. In other words, they can help us. So naturally, someone will look for someone who they think they know me, they love me, and they can really help me. And then they'll naturally be open to taking advice from such a person. So I think when we're thinking about who to advise, we should try to approach relationships where that investment may be made by the other person, because then your ability to convey your advice to them and for them to take it seriously will be increased. But also, these three factors are also ultimately developed in relationship. So if you find someone who may not have necessarily these three things, but you see potential, openness, then it could be a worthwhile relationship to pursue. And then, of course, one has to decide how many individuals. Like, for example, we have a mentorship system here, and I'm not sure the exact number, but there is a limit on the number of mentees you can have, because naturally we have limited amounts of time. So yeah, those are some other practical considerations.
So in one sense, what you're saying is, when we are if we as a speaker are trying to give advice, or it is largely dependent on whether the person receiving advice has developed a certain level of openness and eventually trust. True. And over a period of time, how would you assess the success of this whole process of coaching? What would be the parameters for that?
Of course, I don't think in spiritual life, when we're trying to help devotees go forward, we realize that it is about a destination, but it's not about a destination as well. And let me explain what I mean. The destination is pure devotional service, and we want, people to reach there. But the other aspect is that we just want people to make as much progress towards that as they can. And so I think when we're assessing the success of any relationship, it's not necessarily about how far they are from the goal, but how much closer they've come to the goal as a result of the relationship that you have with them. In other words, if I was to go in and say I was working with these 20 individuals, my measure of success for them would not be that after 2 years with them, they should all be chanting 16 rounds. That's the destination where I'm trying to take them. But my measure of success would be, how far have I brought them, and where were they, and where are they now? Maybe they're only chanting 8 rounds, but they weren't doing anything before. So I think it has to be based around progress and improvement. And then you may say, okay, but what aspects of progress and improvement? And I think it's qualitative and quantitative. There has to be some quantitative measure of improvement, which a genuine external commitment to spiritual life. But then there also has to be a qualitative analysis that this person now has more faith in me. They've overcome certain anarthas or blocks that we may not see in terms of a number, but there's definitely improvement there. And then we have to do that analysis on both sides to see how well the relationship is working.
Qualitative and quantitative. This is an interesting point which you mentioned about assessing the success. Sometimes I say that when we are in our spiritual life, if we are feeling discouraged, we need to look back to see how far we have come. If we are feeling proud, we have to look ahead to see how far we have to go. So it depends on what state of a person is in, what state we are looking for. So it's a lot of patience will be required to present Krishna consciousness in a customized way to different individuals. And so do you see this as something happening? You are trying to do this in London. Do you see this happening in UK and other places also? Do you see this happening elsewhere in the world? In one sense, in Radha Gopinath temple, the consular system was to some extent for this purpose. And there are a lot of devotee care initiatives. Now, devotee care has many different aspects to it. But overall, do you see this as a trend that is happening?
Yeah, I think definitely we do have much more devotee care systems which are being created and implemented in different parts of the world. We have programs like Bhakti Vriksha, where there's a very personal care. I guess today what I'm stressing on more than the system, which I think is moving in a good direction, is to improve the quality of the advice giving. As I said, it's the most frequent service we do. It can be the most difficult service that we do. It can also be the most rewarding service that we do. And it can also be the most dangerous service that we do. And therefore, my point more is on the quality of how we then give that advice and guidance and training each other and helping each other to become better givers of advice. Like, say, for example, I think another really important principle in giving advice is balancing the practical and the transcendental. And I think we sometimes get the balance wrong, Like, say, for example, someone's going through a bereavement. Then what I find is that devotees can go to one extreme or the other. Either they go on a very transcendental extreme where they try to give the person knowledge, no one's died, the wise lament neither, you got to go beyond it, you got to think of the vision of eternity. And or it just becomes very sentimental, very emotional care, very, a lot of kindness, but no injection of spiritual wisdom that will elevate the consciousness and elevate the discourse. And generally, we find no one will go to one complete extreme than the other, but they tend towards one or the other. And again, it's about how to bring it to the middle as a giver of advice, where you give people something practical they can do, something tangible, something down to earth and relatable. And within that, you give them spiritual knowledge that will then elevate the discourse and elevate the consciousness to a higher level. And so, it's such an art, like devotees are having a relationship problem. They're having a relationship problem with someone else. So again, we can just give very transcendental tips, hate the disease, not the disease. Or we can say, ultimately, just very, transcendental.
I think, see, for
Or we
example,
can just go into friendship counseling, like understand their heart. And, so somehow we need to bring those together.
True. Yeah, this balance of transcendental practical is so important. Just recently now, because of COVID, lots of devotees have their relatives, or in India at least, departing. So many devotees ask me, what can we read, which section of scripture can we read, or how can we counsel people? Now some devotees suggested read Garud Puran. Now Garud Puran has some scary descriptions of the journey of the soul through hell. That's not going to console at all. So, and I was taken aback to find that grieving is a big thing. It's a universal human experience, but there's not a single book from the Hindu perspective on grieving. So I just did a 3-part course on growing through grief. So what you talk about, the balance between I tried to negotiate that. In fact, Krishna tells Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita that you're not the body or the soul. In fact, in the 13th chapter itself, Krishna says that those in knowledge are not attached. And he uses specifically the word putra dara graha adishu, to sons, wives, and others like that. And yet, this is the 13th chapter. And in the 13th day of the Kurukshetra war, Abhimanyu dies. And Krishna doesn't throw any philosophy at Arjuna at that time. Krishna is very empathic, very gentle, very encouraging. So, how the philosophy is to be implemented, to be actualized in life, how it is to be shared, that is an art which has to be very carefully learned. So, true, relationships also, for devotees, we often focus on humility, and humility is very important. All of us need to develop that. But at the same time, if we are to do some service for Krishna, as devotees, sometimes we also need to be assertive. So I think focusing only on one side can lead to problems. So now we don't want to become aggressive and abusive or abrasive. That's another extreme. But that balance between the practical and the transcendental is vital. So
it's like this beautiful example of the potter who's molding, I think it's a potter or a sculptor, or whatever it may be. And what they do is one hand they put inside. And then from the outside, they knock. So if that hand is not inside and they knock, you'll break. And if the hand is just inside, but there's no knocking, there's no change. So how effective are we in giving that support and then knocking in order to, build a beautiful spiritual life in partnership with someone? Are we able to do that? It's such an art, how to actually balance that. And so I think the more that mentors or people doing this service come together and share ideas with each other, then they'll go out there and they'll just become so much more edified and empowered when they speak to people. Because remember, here is Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur saying that the platform speaker can't do as much as the personal coach can do in terms of practically solving people's problems. So that the amount of influence that a personal coach has on someone's life is actually, it's vast. So just as we train devotees in speaking, we do courses, so we make sure they know Shastra. We should also have the similar amount for giving advice, because it's a game-changing service.
True. So I also liked one point which you mentioned earlier, that irrespective of the system that might be there, whether whatever devote name we have, whatever structure we have, what is important is that how do we improve the quality of the advice that is given. And that focus also is empowering, in the sense that you are not waiting for a system to change. Whatever the system, we can each devotee at an individual level can work to try to contribute better wherever they are. So are there any other points you would like to discuss? I had a couple of points to make.
I would just say, so we kind of talked a little bit about what we should do before we give advice. Then we talked quite a bit about, the kind of advice and the factoring that we have to kind of build into the equation when we give advice. And then I would just say also another really important thing is what we do after we give advice.
It's remarkable that I was going to raise the same point. And I said a couple of points. That is good. We are thinking on the same lines. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's so important what we do after we give advice, because how something lands in someone's heart is very, very important. So I think the first thing is, I try to do this when I give advice, is I just get feedback and I ask the person, how does this sound to you? Is it achievable? Do you think you can do it? What potential obstacles could there be in this? Preempt any difficulties that they may have in following your advice by having a discussion, so you close it up nicely. It's almost like when you do an operation, you open up an issue, then you go in and you sort everything out, but then close it up in a nice way so the person can walk away as a healthy individual.
I think one major difference between advising and instructing also is that the locus of responsibility stays with the individual. And I think that as a movement is important for us, not just for, say, managerial or legal purposes, but also from the perspective of the kind of the world we live in. If we give an instruction and doesn't work, then that person may blame. And there could be various reasons why it happened. But in general, for the growth of an individual, outsourcing the decision-making process to someone else is never healthy. And
I think that in the institutional responsibility and personal responsibility is it's all, there's a tension there. I almost see it like what the institution does is it creates the boundaries of the playing field. And then within that playing field, the individual has the responsibility to do, and act and approach and make decisions like that. And, like a psychological need within each one of us is safety and also freedom. It doesn't matter who you are. Everyone needs a certain amount of safety. If we say safety and freedom as a continuous, everyone is somewhere along that. And there's an aspect of both in everyone's life. And I think one of the interesting thing about ISKCON is that you can find, as you go to different parts of the ISKCON world, you can find different sizes of playing field. Where there's maybe, a little less freedom and a little more safety, and places where there's more freedom and less kind of institutional boundary around what you do. And so it's for everyone to choose their playing field, find a space within the movement where they feel they get the freedom, and then within that playing field, they have to take the responsibility themselves.
So it's almost like you can say it's like we're playing the same game, but almost somewhat different versions of the game. If you consider cricket, there are different formats of cricket. So we are all trying to be Krishna conscious, but a different combination of safety and liberty. And in one sense, human psychology is also like that. Some people are more enterprising and risk-taking, and some people are more security seeking. So the ideal the ideal situation is, again, what you said earlier about the flow. How much challenge, how much adventure or liberty or freedom does a person want, and how much does it provide them? How much does the situation provide them? So finding that is very important. And again, one more thing which with respect to the guidance, I realized is that sometimes even a guide has to have the maturity, the advisor, that maybe I am not the best person to give advice to this person, and maybe gracefully hand over that person to someone else. Okay, the way you think, the way you are, maybe this person will be able to advise you better.
Yeah. No, that was one of the points I was to raise. Yeah, that sometimes it also makes a lot of sense to just get another opinion and have another devotee who can help, or to verify, or to augment the advice that you've been given.
So you're talking that augment the advice, you're talking from the receiver's perspective or the giver's perspective, or both?
Both could be either. Yeah.
Okay.
And I kind of, just on a related point, I kind of heard a little bit of the podcast you had with Radhe Shampu, and he was making the point of individuals having access to many leaders, not just one leader. And it's a similar point here, that there can be different devotees who are expert in different areas, and therefore you may be an advice giver for someone, but it's not that you can't draw on the experience of other individuals, and they can't draw on the experience of other individuals in certain specific issues where they may have more of a wholesome understanding. So, and this is a really important point, that sometimes as givers of advice, we don't have to know the answer to everything. And sometimes we may feel a subtle pressure, or we may create that expectation within ourselves, and then we can do a discredit to a devotee.
That's also the system of Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra. So there is, apart from the particular teacher, particular advisor, there are other advisors also. There are other people who can turn to guidance from also. If you look at the scriptures also, look at the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, in general, we see either Ram in the forest or the Pandavas in the forest. They hear from many different sages. So it's they are getting advice from various perspectives. And in fact, one of the questions, if you read the Mahabharata is a very big book, and if you read the philosophical conversations in the Mahabharata, now Yudhishthir is repeatedly asking different versions of the same question. Now, why did such a catastrophe befall me and my family? And different sages are answering from different perspectives. So we don't know that a particular answer from a particular perspective, from a particular source, may actually satisfy the person. We don't have to think that, what is that called? I think in Christianity, the savior syndrome. We are not the saviors. We are actually, as I said, that I like the word advisors. So that's true.
One other very important thing, I think, after we've given advice, is that we have to be detached. And I think this is sometimes one of the most difficult ones, because you invest time, you listen to someone, you hear them out, you do all the thinking, you rack your brains, and then you give them advice, and then they don't take it, they don't act on it. There's one famous saying where it takes a good person to give good advice, but it takes a great person to accept good advice. So it actually takes a lot of spiritual advancement, not a lot of spiritual, but a lot of trust, a lot of an investment for someone to then take your advice and implement it. And as givers of advice, we shouldn't underestimate that and just expect that everyone will follow everything we tell them to do. Because if you do that, then you may find yourself becoming very frustrated and then giving up on relationships, giving up on individuals. So it's an important point to realize that someone also may want to follow your advice. Sometimes when someone doesn't follow their advice, we immediately question, do they respect me? Do they trust me? Are they really serious about this relationship? But what we don't realize is that another reason why they may not be following through is just because they have a weakness within them. They do trust you. They do take you seriously. They do want to follow what you have to say, but they just can't. And so we have to be ready for that. Otherwise, we just feel, again, like you were saying, like, I just spent 2 hours with you. I could have gone out and distributed 40 books, but I took this quality time with you and nothing's come from it. And so we have to be very careful. Otherwise, we'll just become advisors and then we'll pull out too quickly. Now, it has to be balanced, because you also have to realize when you're not able to be having an impact on people's lives. And then you may say, clearly, I'm not the person to help this individual. But a certain amount of detachment is required to at least give the space and time for the relationship to possibly work.
I like how you phrased it also. I am not the right person to help this person. Help. It's not that person is a bad person because they're not taking our help. So these are all ways in which sometimes a person may not take the advice, but still they may take a positive impression about the advisor. And that may help them eventually in their spiritual life, if not immediately. So sometimes the success of an interaction, like you earlier talked about sowing seeds, sometimes even a one-to-one interaction may lead only to sowing a seed. It may not lead to the manifesting of the bhakti latabi or the result emergence of the fruits and the flower of the fruits. So we also need to be satisfied with that, and that is especially not easy if we have invested a lot of time and thought and energy.
Yeah, sometimes the devotees, they may ask someone, who made you a devotee? Who made you a devotee? It's like a common kind of question. Or how did you become a devotee? And we all know it's a timeline, it's a process, it's a life cycle, and there were many things which happened along your journey. At what point did you become a devotee? It depends how you are you talking about the first contact? Are you talking about the first, philosophical acceptance? Are you talking about the first devotee that you really connected with? All of these things are on the life cycle, on the life journey. And so, yeah, it's a very important point that someone who's an advisor, they also have to accept that I may not be the person walking side by side with this person to perfection, but maybe I'll just be taking them on to the next person or the next stage or the next situation. And that's glorious. That's wonderful if we're able to do that. And just on detachment, there are many sannyasis in our movement who are gurus, and here at the manor, I've had the opportunity to serve many of them, and also being in the room when gurus are advising their disciples, and then being aware of what the advice was and what happened after. And then you realize that even gurus are not able to advise their disciples and ensure that those disciples will follow. So if gurus are not able to do it, as an advisor, we should also not have an inflated kind of unrealistic expectation of how people will necessarily or should react to whatever advice we give them.
Okay, that's a sobering thought. Yeah, I have talked also with several spiritual masters, and one of the things that they're told is that it's even they don't so much give instructions to people, because it's more of it depends on the level of the receptivity, the level of the relationship. So they may also, because in one sense not obeying the spiritual master is a serious thing, not obeying advisor is okay, that's a different thing. So it is not just so it is spiritual masters themselves take the responsibility to prevent putting the disciple in a position where the disciple might commit guru aparadh. So that's also in one sense a part of the broader understanding of the ninth offense, to instruct a faithless person in the glories of the holy name. Broadly, it means to give an instruction that people can't have faith in, that people don't have the adhikar to follow. So, yeah, detachment, it brings us back to karmanyevadhikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana. True.
And Krishna has that detachment. He ultimately he steps away at the end and says, it's interesting because Krishna says, Yatechasi tata kuru, and then in the next verse he says, but I'll tell you my supreme instruction. So he's emotionally invested. He's willing for Arjun to do it. In his heart, he's saying, come on, Arjun, do it. But he does also give that space as well. So it's almost like it's an inner desire for that individual, but you have to give the, like that, in the beginning you give love, then you give discipline, and then you have to ultimately give independence. And then the final thing I would say is
1 minute about that Krishna Arjuna thing. See, Chakravarti Pad's commentary, what it seems to indicate is that after Krishna gives the you could say the detached kind of, now you do what you want, but he sees Arjuna actually eager for more. Arjuna is pensive and Arjuna is eager, what should I do? So then Krishna's heart overflows with compassion. So in one sense, there is a difference between detachment and indifference. So Krishna is detached, but he's not indifferent. And because he's not indifferent, that's why when he sees Arjuna is seeking more, he gives more. So indifferent means I did my job, now now everything else is your responsibility. But detached is I did my job, but if there's something more you want me to do, there's something more I can do to help, I'm ready to do that. So it's a subtle but a very significant difference. It's not that 65 and 66 as cancelling 64. In 1864 is Krishna is saying, do what you desire. But Krishna is almost giving instruction 65, 66. So it is a matter of levels. So it's actually that section of the Gita is one of my favorite is my favorite section. How Krishna's heart comes out more and more in all those verses.
And yeah, that is so important, because if you're giving someone advice and at the very end you just become so detached that you just say, okay, there it is, I'm gone, it almost leaves the person with a feeling that, they're much less likely to take it on, because they feel, oh my God, like, is he really with me still? But when you say, look, it's up to you, but I'm here, I'm going to help, I'm going to, and this was the last point I was going to make, that after we give advice, we must follow up. We must follow up and we must say, how's it going? How was it possible? Do we need to change it? Do we need to, was there some negative thing that came from it that we need to address again? And again, like a surgeon, like doing the operation, but then, coming back and seeing how everything is healing. So it's very much this metaphor of a surgeon, is a very, I remember you using that metaphor of a surgeon when talking about the cutting words of a sadhu. And you were mentioning that first you do also, you don't just go in with a knife, you also do an anesthetic, you prepare the ground, and then you go in, you cut in a very measured way. And, so yeah, it's such a powerful metaphor, like the metaphor of a surgeon, and how that relates to giving advice.
True. Follow up, sometimes it can seem intrusive to some people, But for many people, actually, follow-up shows care. And one of the things which I have found, I write regularly and I try to encourage devotees to write. So in general, in trying to develop any good habit, this is the concept of having some habit partners or accountability partners. It makes a huge difference. That you just have to tell, maybe every week, what did you do? Even if it's a 5-minute interaction, just the knowledge that, okay, I'm going to have this interaction, that keeps us focused. Otherwise, it's so easy to get distracted, to get lost. So now, with respect to follow up, also, I mean, we'll just conclude with this, but I would say that the follow up also has to be a little open ended. That means rather than demanding or expecting that the person has done it, done whatever we had told, it's like, it's more again, going back to a medical metaphor, it's if a person if somebody is operated on, and now they are supposed, their hand was in a cast and now its sling has come out and they're trying to raise it. So if they are not able to raise their hand, we don't hold them guilty for that. It's more of, okay, what went wrong? And yes, maybe they didn't do the exercises that were required, maybe they didn't take the medication that was required. That could be a possibility, but that's not the presumption. So one of the things that I find is, especially with authority figures, is that if what they have done is not told, sometimes they just presume that the subordinate is at fault. Sometimes the situation may be wrong. So there are so many other factors. So this could be a big subject, but maybe what are your thoughts about being non-judgmental in dealing with people? In one sense, to progress, but whether somebody is progressing or not, we have to make judgments. Otherwise,
just before I go on to that, like I was just reading Giriraj Maharaj's new book, and
yeah,
and he talks about this Srila Prabhupada giving him a very strong instruction to write books, to write. And, then he got loaded with many projects. And then eventually he took that up, and then he makes this very strong point that the spiritual master's instructions can be delayed but never disobeyed. Yes. And it's very poignant because, everything, again, you're right, it has its timeline. And it might not have been the right time for that person, but it's sitting there, and the person has registered your advice and is working on it. So that's a really important point, that sometimes your advice is not that it's been rejected, but it's sitting there, and someone will take it seriously at the appropriate time. And so we shouldn't become discouraged that if something doesn't immediately appear to be implemented.
So in one sense, we are deferring judgment also. Just like they may delay the instruction of the spiritual master, we may also need to defer judgment about where they are or why they are doing what they are doing. So true. If we could actually adopt the coaching like this, the movement will become much more of a home, rather than, we have many different metaphors. There's the metaphor of the home, there's a more metaphor of the battlefield, so the home office, the metaphor of the boot camp, there is a metaphor of cantonment, military camp, where we are going to go
Hospital.
out. Sorry, hospital. Yeah. So I think every metaphor has its utility. At the same time, if we are going to see somebody going to practice bhakti in the long run, nobody stays lifelong in a hospital. Nobody stays lifelong in a office. So there has to be the feeling that where we are practicing bhakti, the association, that is like a home. And that this kind of coaching relationship would play a key role in giving that sense of belonging and connectedness. So true. So
that's a beautiful point, Prabhu. I think you've I think that point that you've just made is really a beautiful conclusion. And yeah, I think it's such an important topic, and I'm happy we had the opportunity today to, at least for myself, edify my understanding on this.
Oh, it was, you know, there are many of these things which were for me uh, nebulous or unarticulated. But the way I can clearly see you thought deeply about it and you had a very good structure. So I'll try to summarize your structure with your permission. But so we started the discussion with about your journey and how you initially were doing a lot of outreach, giving talks and distributing books, but then you felt inspired to cultivate a group of devotees at one place. And that's where that beautiful quote of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, that those who can benefit people more are not the platform speakers, but those who guide personally, because they can address specific issues and have more enduring impact. And then the whole discussion was centered on that. So broadly, if we talk about giving classes is about introducing a gap, telling people that where they are is far from where they can be or they should be, the gap between the practical and the ideal. And then if that gap is too much, then either people bring down the ideal or they just go away from this journey, or they are provided guidance to move from the practical to the ideal. And that guidance involves essentially, so we discussed about Sambandha, Abhideya and Prayojan. So Prayojan is very, very attractive to the heart, the beautiful loving pastimes of Krishna. You can say the Sambandha is quite attractive to the head. Everything seems to logically fall in place. This is the purpose of life, this is the meaning of life. But Sambandha is where things can become quite messy. So how do we actually apply? So that example of telling devotees to distribute books as contrasted with giving them some support, some guidance, some resources to distribute books, that is a very apt example. And that is with more with respect to an activity. So even for something which is a very external kind of activity, if some support is required, then how much more would that be required for the inner work that is the essence of bhakti? So purity is very much required. That's our aspiration in bhakti. At the same time, it's a challenge. So progress, not perfection. That is a repeated theme you talked about. And for that purpose, that the individual guidance is important. And then when you talk about coaching, personal coaching, it could be at three levels. One is one-to-one interactions, where a devotee helps somebody else, and then small groups where devotees come together and flesh out the process and churn their hearts in association. And the third is even our classes become a little more practical. So we integrate, I was talking about three levels which you mentioned: one-to-one coaching, group churning, and then more practical aspects within the classes also. So talking with people rather than talking to or talking at people helps to understand where they're coming from, and then our classes become more relevant, more helpful for people. So now with respect to one, I think we among those three we focused maximum on the one-to-one coaching, what all would be required. So the first thing is that we don't give instructions, we give advice. So the difference is that in advice, neither the speaker nor the audience feels too much pressure. Now the speaker nor the receiver that I have to be perfect, or the receiver has to feel I have to obey everything. And then there's a possibility for iterations, discussion. And advice also means that people get to get their own intuition reinforced, like happened with Narada, Vyas and Narada. So then while giving advice, the first thing is hearing. So hearing helps us to understand where people are coming. It reassures people that we have understood them, and it sometimes helps them also figure things out just by the act of speaking. And then we discussed how thinking is very difficult. So thinking is more easily done by talking, relatively speaking. And then so hearing is one aspect, then questioning and reflecting were the second aspect. So questioning helps us to go beyond the tip of the iceberg. People may not be sharing the whole problem because they themselves may not have understood it. They may be embarrassed to share it entirely, or they may themselves be needing the words to articulate their thoughts. So the questioning helps, and reflecting helps us understand their emotions. Helps. So reflecting is also a process, not just repeating, but also putting what they are saying in the perspective of broader scriptural knowledge that we have. And then, if you consider that after with that, if you're giving advice, it's always better to give a multi-level advice, so that people can people don't feel uh, people don't feel that they have let down someone whom they actually respect, because that can be immensely demoralizing. So even if they take one step forward and they feel benefited by that, then that itself encourages and inspires them, that helps them move on. And Prabhupada also sometimes told that I'm giving this advice for you. It's so Prabhupada gave customized advice, which was not necessarily the ideal, but whatever was suited for that person. So when during the process of giving advice, it is more a matter of not just giving but concluding. So and preempting, anticipating what obstacles they're going to face, so that they feel equipped to deal with the issue. And then I think a major part of the talk was detachment after we give the advice, that just sometimes people may not be able to follow, not because they are disobedient or insubordinate. Sometimes they just have weakness. So what was it? Weakness, we called Bhaktivinoda Thakur, weakness is acceptable, but hypocrisy, no, what was uh,
Cheating.
cheating is not acceptable. So in that, I think we discussed earlier about these four defects. The first three are largely not in our control, but the fourth is. And if we rather than blaming someone for being dishonest or cheating, we may have to check whether we are creating an atmosphere where a person can be honest, or we are creating an atmosphere where a person is you know is in one sense, they feel their very survival depends on covering things up. So that's why Guhyam Akhyati Pruchhyati, and a forum for that is so important. And detachment also means that sometimes people may not take the advice, and we need to accept that. As you said, that even gurus sometimes find that disciples may not take their advice, and that also reflects back to the point that giving instructions is undesirable, because then that puts them people in the position of not having obeyed. And overall, if we are developing a relationship with people, then the way of assessing the success is, we have a destination, but it's the important thing is the journey. Rather than checking how far they have come to the destination, we can say how far they have come from their starting point. And that can encourage them to keep moving. That can also encourage us in terms of how much we have been able to help them. And to some extent, we may also have to broaden our definition of success. So that depends also on what is glorified within the community, because whatever is publicly appreciated starts becoming the aspiration of individual devotees. So when we recognize the importance of coaching in due course and to a due degree, then that also helps devotees to take up that as a serious service, as an important responsibility. Like Prabhupada himself was doing that in the 1970s, 1960s, we could say, overall. And then I think the conclusion was that the relationships are what is going to sustain a person in bhakti, and it is this kind of coaching and the connection coming from coaching, that's what will create a home in people's hearts. And where they find a home, it's that we are not just an office or a hospital or a missionaries field. It's where they find the home is, it depends. We could say that balance between safety and freedom or liberty. So each devotee will have to find out, each seeker, we could say, will have to find out where they get the best atmosphere. And with respect to selecting a guide, someone who knows them, somebody who understands them, cares for them, and somebody who they feel can help them. So, and it may also be that it's not one person who does everything. One person. So detachment can be also that, not that the person may not obey me, that is one aspect. Detachment also means that I don't have to be the sole deliverer of the person. I can take advice from others. I can encourage them to take advice from others. So it's like so we are not restricting access through coaching. Rather, we are facilitating them to become a part of the community, and there can be multiple channels for that. And the feedback aspect was also important. If people, after they do something, follow up is very helpful, because that inspires and motivates them to do things, and also to address obstacles which may have prevented them from doing those things. So this is a very important subject. And also your point that whatever be the system of devotee care, it's more of matter of the individual taking responsibility to give advice in a more effective way. And giving advices, those four adjectives were most frequent, most demanding, most rewarding, most dangerous service. So yeah, I think we need all more reflection and more training so that the service can be done more effectively. Yes, bro. Any things you would like to add in the conclusion?
Oh, thank you. I think you summarized it wonderfully. And I thank you, Chaitanya Charanprabhu, for your amazing service. You're one of your number one fans. And my hope is that many of your podcasts will be transcribed into a book. I think that would be an incredible service to the Vaishnava community. I think through these conversations, I've heard many of them. So many beautiful points are coming. And so we thank you for doing this, and hope it will be in a book and not lost in the mountain of internet information and internet videos, because I think it's very, very valuable what you've done. Thank you so much, Prabhu.
Thank you, Prabhu, for sharing your time today. And yes, I also hope to take this knowledge in some other formats. We have discussed about it a little bit earlier. Let's see how it works out. Thank you.
Sure.
Wonderful talking with you.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.